So now I'd like to introduce our moderators for today's session, Jason Stewart, who's an executive in residence at the Global Risk Institute. Jason, over to you.
Thank you, Vanda. Today's session is the second in GRI's macroeconomic webinar series. This series aims to help our members understand monetary and fiscal policy's transition in 2022 and beyond, with a focus upon their impacts and risks. We will begin today with a presentation and remarks from Bill White. We will then move to the Q&A component with Bill that I will moderate. I'm pleased now to briefly introduce our distinguished guest and speaker, Bill White. Bill is a senior fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute. He formerly served as the chairman of the Economic and Development Review Committee at the OECD in Paris until April 2018. Bill began his professional career at the Bank of England. He then spent 22 years with the Bank of Canada, including being appointed advisor to the governor in 1984 and deputy governor of the BOC in 1988. Bill joined the Bank for International Settlements in 1994, becoming economic advisor and head of the Monetary and Economic Department, or MED, in 1995. At the BIS, he oversaw the preparation of its prestigious annual report and had overall responsibility for MED's research. He was also a member of the BIS Executive Committee. Bill is a former member of the ISING Committee, advising the German Chancellor on G20 issues. He has in recent years published many articles on topics related to monetary policy and financial stability. In 2016, Bill was awarded the Adam Smith Prize, the highest award of the National Association of Business Economists. Welcome, Bill, and please begin.
Well, thank you very much, Jason, for that introduction. And let me thank, too, the Global Risk Institute for having invited me to speak to you all today. There are some very interesting and alarming things going on, so it'll be challenging to talk about them. Clearly, everybody is thinking about the implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think we're absolutely right to be so preoccupied. Having said that, I think we also have to recognize that this cannot be treated as an isolated event, in the sense that this event, just like COVID that came before it, is a shocking development that will have an impact on a system, an economic system, that I will contend was already under significant stress. So that in a certain sense, the stresses that I'll be talking about were a bit like the comorbidities in COVID, that you get really bad outcomes, not because of the disease itself, but because of the fact that it's triggered something deeper that is really causing a problem. So I want to put a lot of stress on that aspect of things. And I also want to stress that, as the title of this presentation implies, that many of the underlying problems that we have in our current economic and financial system, I think, and I will make the case for this, I think are the byproducts of the policies that we have been following in the past. So we have some issues here for which I think we collectively will have to take some responsibility. What I'm going to suggest here is that our economic policies over the course of the last few decades have been premised on a number of false beliefs about the nature of how the economy actually works. A philosopher would say that we've made a fundamental ontological error in misjudging the nature of the system that we're confronted with. Modern macroeconomic theory is, in that sense, fundamentally flawed. The false beliefs are that the economy is simple, static, and therefore that it's understandable and that it's controllable. And what goes along with that, and this is part of the economic framework or the economic models, whatever you want to call them, is the belief that the economy is fundamentally self-stabilizing and that fundamentally, really bad things can't happen. But I guess we know from the experience of 2008, the beginnings of the great financial crisis, to say nothing of COVID and the Russian invasion, that really bad things can happen. So if that's the sort of false belief, the economy is static and simple, what's the true belief? I believe that we should be thinking, all of us, about the economy as being a complex adaptive system, of which there are many in both nature and society. And these complex adaptive systems are basically interactive systems with many, many heterogeneous agents working together, trying in a sense to be efficient, groping their way like a forest, evolving towards greater efficiency. But one of the problems with complex adaptive systems is that the search for efficiency comes with a downside. And that is, as you become more and more efficient, the system becomes more and more stressed and less capable of carrying on. And breakdowns occur in these systems on a regular basis, according to a power law. So that's the first point. The way we think about the economy is fundamentally flawed. Second point is that we tend to think, we economists, that the economy is a kind of standalone system, but it's not. As the third bullet here makes clear, the economic system is nested in other complex adaptive systems, and it's vulnerable to their failings. So, for example, if we have a failing in the political system, the environmental system, the public health system, you will have implications on the economy. And finally, and again, something that doesn't seem to be broadly recognized, in the real world, these systems have multiple indicators, these complex systems have multiple indicators of stress. So that putting all your eggs in one basket, for example, saying if we have price stability, everything will be fine, it's just simply fundamentally wrong. And closely related, I would note, with these systems, these complex adaptive systems, is they have tipping points. And that is to say that everything can look just fine for long periods of time, and then something happens and triggers a collapse, which can be either partial or in some cases total. So these systems are very different from the kind of systems that our policymakers have wrongly, I think, assumed. I also want to make the case that our economic policy solutions to the problems that we faced over the course of the last decades, really, have actually become the problem. Monetary policy, for example. When you think about monetary policy, stabilizing the CPI, fighting too low inflation or deflationary tendencies. This has been the chosen way of dealing with downturns. Expansionary monetary policy. I guess it started in 1987. After the Volcker tightening. The first example of monetary easing was in 1987 when the stock market took a big dip. Then we did the same thing again in 1990, in 1997, in 1998, in 2001, in 2008, and now we're doing it all over again with COVID, doubling down, in fact, with COVID and quantitative expansion and all the rest of it. And the difficulty, of course, is that each time one does that, you're encouraging the private sector to take on both more debt so that you get more credit, as it were, to spend, which I guess is the purpose of the exercise. But the difficulty is that if you do it repeatedly, you eventually get debts building up to such a point that they impede further growth. Second point is government debt is unsustainable. We have not been using fiscal policy in a strongly counter-cyclical way in recent decades, although it has been used in that way since COVID. Nevertheless, with respect to government debt, the the tightening of government debt in upswings has never been as great as the easing of fiscal policy in the downturns. And so the upshot has been that cycle after cycle, government debt has been building up and now has reached levels as a ratio, say, of GDP that is really unsustainable. And it's important not just to look at the on-balance sheet stuff. You also have to take into account all the off-balance sheet stuff that governments are responsible for. So I would think, for example, in the United States about Medicare, Medicaid, pensions of various sorts. The Cato Institute has done a number of studies on this. Their general contention is that if you add in all of the off-balance sheet stuff, most governments are now technically insolvent. In the United States, I think the measure is something like the government liabilities are 400% of GDP and climbing, which just about says it all. The third problem I've got, and again, I'm talking about long-standing economic policies that in the end give you perverse results. I would just note financial regulation still has significant shortcomings. Capital ratios are way up for the banks, which is undeniably a good thing. But the question is, are they up enough? And I think Martin Wolf said at one point, I've got the quote, I think it was something like three times nothing is not very much. So we've got a big increase in capital, but the question is it enough? The last point, I guess, is ever widening safety nets, which create longer term problems. And here, I think, again, if you go back sort of over decades, what you see is that each time there's a downturn and each time the financial sector seems to have a problem, the answer is for the government and the central banks to expand the safety net. And the last expansion, of course, was in March 2020, when the Fed and many other countries, many other central banks became the market maker of last resort. But this is a process, this ever widening safety net that I think we all should be conscious of. I'm not sure whether this has to do with financial regulation or whether it has to do with the safety net, but one feature arising from both of those things has been a migration of financial activity out of the regulated sector into other areas. And so the safety net, in a certain sense, has widened to follow them. But this constant sort of evasion on the financial side, I think is creating and will create problems for us as we go forward. So I'm saying that I think underlying problems have been building up. Well, let's move on to the question of prove it. I think there's all sorts of indicators, worrisome indicators of stress in the real economy. And I have it here as that first bullet, which is the slow growth of investment and productivity. There has been a secular slowdown with respect to investment ratios and productivity growth that has been quite remarkable. There has been a growth, again, sort of on the real side, of the proportion of companies that are zombies, that basically have not made any money in recent years and have been kept alive by their financial counterparts. There has been a real growth in monopoly and oligopoly control on the real side. All of these, I think, are things to worry about. When we look at the financial side, I've already mentioned the issue of debt levels building up. We have record high debt levels in the global economy now. They rose significantly through the global financial crisis from 2008, prior to the pandemic. I think they went from something like 280% of GDP to 320% of GDP. Since the pandemic, they've gone up to 360% plus of GDP. We've never seen numbers like these before in peacetime. Not only have the debt levels gone up, but the quality of that debt has been decreasing. You may be aware of the massive increase in the issue of BBB bonds over the course of the last 10 years or so, and it is continuing right on the edge of being junk. There's been a massive decrease in covenants. So we're talking now about all sort of loans that are being made that are covenant light. 70 or 80% of all of those current loans. I would mention that it's not just the advanced market economies that have had these problems. The emerging market economies have been drawn into this debt issue as well. And I'll come back to that later on. The stability of some financial institutions is questionable. I noted before the issue of evasion and the question of whether capital ratios were high enough. There are particular worries in Europe, where of course the market value of many banks is well below the book value. And of course, when I talk about stability of some financial institutions, when you talk about people moving to non-regulated sectors, we don't actually know whether they're questionable or not. All we know is that we do not know because they're in an unregulated sector. Asset prices are historically high. I know that they've fallen back in the last month or so, particularly the tech stocks, the non-FANGs. But you look at things, for example, like the Case-Shiller, which is still very high. House prices, perhaps the central asset that most of us have. House prices historically high in many countries around the world. Markets are functioning badly. There have been many instances in recent years of flash crashes, anomalies in financial markets that just sit there that we've never seen before. Arbitrage is no longer working. And that includes the US Treasuries. I mean, the US Treasury market basically sort of seized up in September of 2019, March of 2020. So these indicators of something's not quite right are everywhere. And I'll just mention just very briefly the resurgence of fraud and outright delusion. Some of the stuff that we've seen are just names: Theranos, Wirecrowd, Greensill, Archegos, Tesla, Hometown International. The list of things that have to do with either fraud or outright delusion is going on and on. And lastly, of course, now we have all of the uncertainties arising from the Russian invasion and from the financial sanctions. And I would say the most important thing is going to be just generalized uncertainty that will lead to potentially a drying up of liquidity, which would be a problem. The sanctions may well lead to people who don't get paid having to sell stuff that they can't sell Russian stuff, so they'll sell something else, fire sales in various places. So there's a lot of issues out there. When I say that I think there are underlying stresses, I think they're really starting to manifest themselves. And I don't want to forget the fact that we've got stresses in some other related systems as well. And as I said before, all of these systems the one will affect the other. Indicators of stress in related systems. The environmental system is obviously the first one. It has received enormous attention in recent years and perhaps even recent months. But real progress is not being made. Greenhouse gases emissions are still going up. Right? So they're not going down on the way to net zero in 2050. They're still going up. Biodiversity is collapsing at an alarming rate still. Political systems threatened by growing inequality and polarization. I think that's one of the things that worries me the most. We've had in a number of countries a polarization where people, in a sense, are no longer even talking to each other. The most classic example are the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States. And this polarization is being magnified not only by internal factors, and I'm thinking really the echo chambers of social media and algorithms that only feed you what you want to hear. We know in terms of these threats to political systems that both the Russians and the Chinese have been involved in what is now being increasingly referred to as hybrid warfare, which is you look for places of discontent, and then you start trying to use false information to make people even more discontented than they already are. Public health systems threatened by COVID. Not only have the public health system been threatened by COVID, but as we're all well aware, it's had huge knock-on effects on the political system and lesser effects even on the public health system. Sorry, not public health system. The last point that I want to make about that public health is that for people who say this is a one-off, I would just remind you this pandemic is a one-off. I did a little research, and apparently there have been 250 what they call zoonotic pathogens identified in the course of the last 70 years. So these are pathogens that go from animals to people. So to say this is a one-off is totally incorrect. I think as we look forward, one of the I guess what I fear the most is that we are heading into a situation like the 1970s, but in fact significantly worse. That we're going to be faced with a number of negative supply shocks, which have the impact of both raising prices and lowering growth at the same time. So stagflation. Now, why would I say that? And why would I say it's worse than the 1970s? Well, in the 1970s, all we had was oil price increases and the loss of the anchovies. Some of you may be old enough, as old as I am, and you remember that, the anchovies. Today, we've got a whole pile of these things to worry about. For a starter, we've got the pre-pandemic resource misallocations. Those low interest rates over decades have actually generated resource misallocations of a very significant degree. When the time comes that the financial institutions are forced to recognize the zombies amongst them and to cut off the extend and pretend, which has been going on for such a long period of time, then we will start to see the prices rise as the competition declines. And we will also, I fear, start to see those with oligopoly and monopoly power using that power to push up prices. And all of this will come out of the pre-pandemic resource misallocations. The second problem is post-pandemic hysteresis. What I mean by that is long-lasting implications of a downturn. And there's quite a literature on this stuff. Two people, Sira and Saxena in particular, have written a number of papers on this. After downturns, the damage is always permanent. And the suggestion that I would make is that this particular post-pandemic problem might be more likely to have those long-lasting results than most. And we've already, we've heard talk about long COVID. There's talk about supply side disruptions, both short-term and long-term. There's a number of things that I think we have to worry about. Third thing we have to worry about is population aging. Charles Goodhart and his colleague Pradhan have written a whole book on this, which I think was called The Great Demographic Reversal, so that we've benefited over the course of the last 30, well, longer, since the war, with the baby boom, globalization more recently, all of that stuff, increasing potential, pushing down prices. It's all about to go into reverse. And that is going to create significant inflationary pressures. Climate change and the costs of mitigation and adaptation. Whether it's mitigation or adaptation, the costs of dealing with climate change are going to be very great. And when you think about mitigation, we're going to have to replace the whole infrastructure that allows energy to be brought to houses and companies away from fossil fuels. That's going to be expensive. Adaptation, the change has already gone on so far. The sea rise, the increase in the sea levels is going to happen to some degree, and the cost of relocation, flood barriers, tougher building requirements, all of that's going to be expensive. Then we got energy shocks, and that's not just related to climate change. It's been related to, in a sense, botched climate change. That we've lowered the investment in oil and gas before we had adequate substitutes for them. And that was underway, you will recall, big increases in energy prices prior to the Russian invasion. But of course, the Russian invasion has just made it significantly worse. Excuse me. And lastly, we've got this issue of deglobalization and the need for resilience. And one might say, well, the Russia invasion has certainly done a lot for drawing a line between different groups of people and fostering deglobalization. But I want to suggest that we were seeing this well before the Russian invasion. And it really has more to do with China than it has to do with Russia. But these are problems that are going to be problems of long standing. I think both depression and high inflation are plausible outcomes. In standard models, of course, you'd get a forecast, and it would say either one or the other, and the two of them together are not possible. But when you look at it from the perspective of it's a complex adaptive system, the first point to recognize is that these systems have highly interactive processes that have got a lot of feedback effects. And these things can lead you, once they get started, in ways that are almost impossible to predict in advance. So I guess what I'm going to say is I think both depression and high inflation are plausible outcomes. One thing that is clear, at least it is to me, is that high debt levels increase the vulnerability and the likelihood of these positive feedback effects in both good times and bad. And the way to think about it is that in good times, the interest rates go up. And if you've got very high debt levels, debt service becomes more difficult. In bad times, of course, your revenues go down and debt service becomes still more difficult. And I would note that there have been a number of economists in the past who have, within the confines of economic analysis, described these things in great detail. So on the debt deflation process, Irving Fisher in 1936 gave a very good description of how the whole thing worked as he was trying to describe the process leading to the Great Deflation. And the high inflation process has been well described by Sargent and Wallace. They give the theory, and the theory is very simple, which is that governments have big debts. So the debt deflation process is mostly to do with private sector debt. The high inflation process has to do with public sector debt. And the way that it works is very simple, which is a government has got a big debt, but it's got a big deficit, so it has to borrow. But because it's got a big debt, people won't lend them the money. And then they have to go into the central bank. And the more they go into the central bank, the more the people worry about fiscal dominance and about inflation. And very quickly, the expectations turn and we have a problem. So we have problems with respect to both private and public sector debt. And these are not things that we should think of as inconsequential. I'm not going to say anything about what central banks should do. Maybe we'll get into that later. Let me just talk about let me speculate on what they seem likely to do. I think as a best guess, it'll be a repeat of the 1970s. Remember, we had two energy price shocks then. And during the first one in 1974, the whole approach was to support growth. And then the second one was to resist inflation when the second one came. The central banks turned and did something different. Why do I think that the central banks are likely to focus first on slower growth? I'm not saying they're not going to tighten. I think they will tighten, but they will tighten less rapidly than they should do. Now, why do I believe that? For starter, central banks, where we are today, is remarkable given the level of inflation that we've already got. We've got real interest rates, which is the nominal rate minus actual inflation or inflationary expectation, at maybe -4, -5. The unemployment rate is pretty close to full employment, or forecast to be pretty close to full employment. It is extraordinary how easy monetary policy is. The Fed's new framework is more pro-growth. They have pivoted towards a real growth objective at exactly the wrong moment. So average inflation targeting, maximum employment, these elements of the new framework are not going to be helpful. The belief that inflation shock is transitory, although they seem to have given up on that grudgingly, at least the Fed has, but others are still saying it's transitory. And the belief that expectations are anchored. A recent article by Jeffrey Rudd from the Fed casts enormous doubt on this whole issue of expectations being anchored in what central banks say they're going to do. I think the most important point is uncertainty about the effects of tightening. The central banks are caught in a kind of debt trap. They know that if they tighten, the whole financial system is vulnerable, as I was just talking about. And that uncertainty, like it's a rabbit caught in the headlights. The uncertainty will lead to stay where you are as a kind of default. And lastly, of course, we've got all these geopolitical concerns about the outcome. We've already heard the Fed say, I'll tighten, but the European Central Bank basically saying we've got to be very, very careful. And I won't go into this, but this could be, in a sense, financial repression in another guise. You say that you're going to fight inflation, but in reality, you're not. And the advantage of that is that the interest rates stay low while the inflation stays high, and the real value of the debt gets smaller and smaller and smaller. This is what happened after World War II. And lastly, a later pivot to tighter policy. Why? I think it's unquestionable that the central banks will eventually say, we're way behind the curve and we've got to catch up. But there's a number of problems. One of them is that the gap between the real rate, what the actual real rate will then be after inflation expectations start to increase, and the rate that you need in order to actually be restrictive, that gap could be enormous. John Cochrane, who's a very well-known economist, contends that even today the gap is of the order of 600 or 700 basis points. Second trap is the debt trap is deeper, and tightening is likely to be even more endangered. And what I worry about is this is where the governments come in. As I said before, the governments are already in deep difficulties with respect to the overall size of their commitments. And it's going to be made worse by stuff that they will have to confront, like the environmental challenges, the public health challenges, and now with the Russia-Ukrainian thing, the military challenges. I think it could imply a growing tolerance for higher inflation. It's not something that anybody wants, but when you're in a very difficult place, as this quote from John Kenneth Galbraith implies, sometimes you have to accept the unpalatable, like more inflation, in order to avoid the truly disastrous. So that would be bad enough in itself. But of course, if you want to tell an even more difficult story, is that tolerance for higher inflation could be supplemented with overt measures towards financial repression in order to keep rates down while the inflation goes up. So not a very happy story, and perhaps not even certainly not one that is going to happen, but it is not totally implausible. And that leads me to my last little comment about good luck. You might just need it.
Bill, thanks very much. We're now going to turn to the Q&A, and with a reminder, if anyone has a question, we invite you to type it into the chat box on the bottom right of the screen to all the panelists. I have a couple here to kick this off, and in that regard, Bill, I'm looking at some of your previous work. Specifically, in early 2020, you wrote about the unintended consequences of easy monetary policy in an article entitled "Why Central Bankers Should Be Humble." Given the pandemic, what would your views be today regarding the need for central banks' humility?
Well, my original contention about the need for humility was fundamentally nested, as it were, in my first slide, which they've made a fundamental error about the way the economy works. And so every time something has happened, they've just doubled down doing what they were doing before. And of course, with COVID, they've done it again. And I guess I would say that there are even greater grounds for being humble now, because they've made the same mistake one more time, which ought to be grounds for humility. But secondly, I think when you think about what the character of the shock, which both reduced aggregate demand and aggregate supply, it could well be that there really wasn't much of a gap between demand and supply that opened up during the pandemic, and therefore no significant disinflationary forces that required the kind of stimulus, unprecedented stimulus, that the central banks gave us. So on both counts, more grounds for humility, I think.
Thank you. Also referring to another article by Martin Wolf recently, where he highlighted the need to take the huge jump in broad money supply growth and monetarism seriously again. He was joined by Mervyn King, who emphasized the substantial monetary overhang coming from central bank stimulus. What's your view of the surge in money supply growth in 2020 and 2021 and of its impacts?
Well, I spent you remind me how old I'm getting. I spent 5 years at the Bank of Canada as the chief technician for implementing monetarism. Okay, where all we focused on was the money supply, and as it turned out, as indeed with many other things that we tried, it was just dead wrong. So I was skeptical for a long period of time about monetary growth. Having said that, and again, as a believer sort of in complex adaptive systems that have got tipping points, and are highly nonlinear, It may well be that small movements in the money supply just get disregarded in the same sort of way as Jeremy Rudd says, small increases in inflation get disregarded in terms of, setting your inflationary expectations. But in both cases, it may well be that there's a kind of threshold level that you get to that point, and all of a sudden you have to say, Houston, we have a problem. And so I would certainly say, looking at the rate of growth of the money supply in the UK, well, the UK, Europe, and certainly the United States, that it is worrisome, and it is consistent. That prior increase is consistent with the increase in inflation we've actually seen. So I'm not a wholehearted reconverter to monetarism, but as an analytical framework, it's always something to be concerned about. The Germans, I think, and those Central European people have been on about this for decades and decades, and they've done so on the basis of their own historical experience, and it's something that we shouldn't forget about.
Thank you. Turning to additional questions from the attendees, and I apologize, they're coming in fast and in significant numbers. And I apologize if we don't get to your question, but I'll start with the first, which would be, do you have any policy suggestions regarding how to escape the debt trap?
Well, something that I've been advocating for, I tried to make the point in my presentation that debt is a problem in all states of nature. Excessive debts are a problem in all states of nature, worrisome. And so the obvious solution is to say we've got to get rid of the debt. Now, the question is, how do you do that? And the answer is you have to face up to overt debt restructuring, that a lot of these debts simply will not be serviced. And the first example, I guess, would be the emerging markets, where now I think the International Monetary Fund says something like 40 or 50% of all lower income countries are in debt distress. So, and it's not just them. I think we need a wider ranging analysis of the debts, and a move, particularly on the part of the banks and those who have extended and pretended to try to deal with that. The difficulty is that we are not well set up, either administratively or judiciously, to deal with these kinds of problems. And the G30, the IMF just came out with a 78-page paper about a week ago, which I've not yet read, on what we need to do to improve our processes for debt restructuring. But debt restructuring has got to be a big part of getting out of this problem. Yeah, I guess that would be the principal thing that I would suggest at this juncture.
Thank you. Next question, is GDP the economic compass of the future? And if not, what would you suggest, either in terms of complementary or different key indicators as the compass?
What, GDP?
Yes.
I think it would be unwise to give up monitoring GDP pretty closely. My recollection is that it is, in fact, highly correlated with most other measures of well-being. Having said that, anybody who focuses on just that number without taking into account the greater good of the greater number in particular is really making a big mistake. So that the issue of who's getting the GDP is every bit as important as whether there is any GDP to be shared around. And what we know is, over the course of the last number of years in many of our countries, inequality of income, inequality of wealth, and above all, and most disturbing, the inequality of opportunity has gone way up. And that is, in my judgment, a very important factor underlying all of the political tensions and the threat to our democratic way of life that we all face. So GDP, don't forget about it, but there's lots of other important numbers as well.
Thank you. I'm going to combine the next two questions, and it comes under the heading of the law of unintended consequences and dynamic evolution within complex adaptive systems. Can you speak to the implications of the potential shift of trade and reserve currencies away from the US in the context of Russia being shut down to a significant degree with SWIFT, recipients of the Belt and Road policy of China looking to pay in different currencies and shifting, but also in the context of the size of the US national debt? How do you see things evolving in terms of global reserve currencies, potential for different blocks?
Well, there are many sort of underlying forces eating away at the primacy of the US dollar in the international financial system. Having said that, it takes decades to undo the networking effects that give the dollar its prominence. And so I'm not looking for any sort of rapid unwinding of the current system, but a slow kind of erosion. There can be no question that these recent attempts to freeze the access of the Russian central bank to the foreign exchange reserves of Russia is going to be effective in terms of what they want to do, and that's good. The bad news is that everybody else is going to be watching and knowing that if they've got their money in some place in ways that it can be in ways in which use can be denied to it, is going to try to find some way to circumvent that problem. So this is another one of these longer term threats. But it's been out there for quite some period of time. I mean, the use by the successive American administrations of the dollar as a geopolitical weapon got to have an impact on people who don't want to be impacted.
Related to this question, do you see this accelerating the growth and diffusion of central bank digital currencies, especially China and others?
Well, the digital currency thing is really a big question. I actually early this afternoon I was watching Tobias Adrian from the IMF giving a webinar on this range of territory. I actually sense a growing, what's the word? I think central bank use of digital currency, I think, is coming down the road, and I think a lot of people will get involved in it. A lot of countries. There are just so many countries that are already either investigating it, doing pilot studies. There's even a couple that have actually rolled it out. China is defined as a pilot study, and they've got 140 million users. 140 million users. This is some pilot study. But there's so many problems, international problems with crypto, and people more and more worried, for example, about the emerging markets. Many of them have really gotten into it in a serious way. You know, other people's cryptocurrencies that are being widely used in Turkey and Russia, and the concern would be that if you have emerging markets that are already vulnerable, and then they get another hit because they've deeply invested in crypto and the crypto loses its value. The other aspect of it, of course, is that it also provides a means through which people can flee their own currency more quickly. So there's a lot of attention on the part of the central banks, the IMF, to these international problems. They understand these problems. And I guess we'll try to make efforts to ensure that they can minimize those undesirable side effects. But I think I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I get the sense that central bank digital currency is coming in one fashion or another, and in large part because they feel the need to cut off at the pass the private sector people that are doing the same stuff. Why give up your seniorage when you don't have to?
Switching gears, Bill, question for reflecting the opposing view to what you've articulated. This question relates to the fact that you and other analysts, investors, practitioners like Ray Dalio have been beating the debt supercycle drum since the 1980s. But given the fact that even with these problems, the complex adaptive system seems to have adapted haphazard or otherwise in recent decades, including the last couple of years, do you see an ability for us to muddle through here?
Well, I think the joke about the guy that jumps out of a 22-story building, and as he's going past the first floor, someone shouts out, "How are you doing?" Guy responds, "So far, so good." That's sort of what these systems are like. And you've got to remember that every time there's been a problem, the central banks in particular, it turns out, have had the wherewithal to deal with it. But they've done so. And this goes back to the 1980s. If you go back and you look at the numbers, in order to deal with the problem, the degree and the magnitude and the speed with which monetary policy expansion has had to be put into play has grown and grown and grown, so that we wind up with the great financial crisis where we had all this unconventional stuff, right? And now in response to the pandemic, it was QE 3 times as big as it had ever been done before, and almost globally, not just the US, but almost globally. The question at issue is whether the official sector has got the wherewithal to be able to pull the iron out of the fire. Right? That it's not the private system that's self-equilibrating. It's the government that's come to the aid. And I guess the whole point that I was trying to make, in a sense, in my presentation, was maybe the firepower of both the central banks and the governments is getting pretty close to being used up. So as the problems become bigger, the capacity to come up with solutions becomes smaller. So we're in a place where we don't really want to be. But talking about, you've been saying that since the 1980s, you're absolutely right. And if there's one big fault that I've made in all of my calls, it's been underestimating the capacity of the central banks to pull the iron out of the fire.
Thank you. Just picking up on a couple of comments you mentioned earlier, this question goes at the Goodhart and Pradhan thesis, which is the impact of China's rise, not only previously with what it did for global savings, global labor supply chains internationally, et cetera, but what are the implications as we look forward in the 2020s? And secondly, how do you see their policy evolving here in the context of their economic slowdown and the challenges they have in the real estate sector?
Yeah. Well, one of the big mistakes that I think the central banks made, and this goes back to the 90s and beyond, was underestimating the impact of these positive supply shocks on inflation. That China in particular, coming into the global supply chain, and India on the services side, and the Eastern European countries, all that stuff, put a profound downward pressure on prices through all sorts of mechanisms, not least the contestability of production in Germany. If workers didn't behave, they'd move the factories to Slovenia. The central banks missed that. The prices wanted to go down. And there's a whole pre-war literature saying that the prices should have been allowed to go down. But the central banks chose not to do that. And in trying to lean against it, I think they've created a lot of those financial and real side stresses that I talked about earlier on. So China was really important in terms of us getting to the place that we're in. But now China is turning around. The population in China, the working age population, has already started to shrink. It's been shrinking now for some years in Japan and Korea, and of course shrinking in Eastern Europe as well. So Charles Goodhart and Pradhan are right that everything that we saw before is now going into reverse. And I think it will put very strong upward pressure on prices going forward. The second question, and actually it is linked to the first, these interconnected systems are all, is what will China do? And in the face of its current problems. And the answer is, the short answer is, I don't know. And I don't think anybody knows, because it's so difficult to read the inner workings of the Chinese Communist Party. But they seem to be working pretty assiduously to reducing debt levels, to getting, in a controlled way, to try to get the property developers in particular to rationalize their activities. And it might well be, given the control that they have over the state apparatus and society at large, that they can pull this thing off. When you think about what I've talked earlier about debt restructuring, the point is that if debts can't be serviced, they won't be serviced. But what you'll have then is a disorderly debt restructuring. And that is going to be far, far more costly than an orderly debt restructuring, where the creditor and the debtor somehow get together and, in a way that is cushioned by the state, strike a deal about how and when to write off debt. I think for us, as I said earlier on, in the Western countries, we've got to make a number of important changes in order to allow us to do that. The Chinese, just given the nature of where they've come from historically, they may already have the degree of control that will facilitate their doing it, and I hope they're successful. But they certainly do seem to realize now the dangers that you can get into by allowing the untrammeled growth of debt, both private and public.
Thank you. With apologies to the host of other good questions that we don't have a chance to get to, one final question, and that is, as a number of our attendees have asked, and you eloquently set out in your remarks, you've examined central banks starting with low interest rates and QE beginning as crisis responses, but then they've morphed into ongoing large-scale monetary support. In your view, why do so many former central bankers think so differently about ultra-easy policy when they're no longer in charge? And looking here at articles by the so-called Gang of Eight of ex-senior central bankers, and more recently by Mervyn King, Andy Haldane, and others.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's really sort of two parts. One of them is, why do they keep doing the same thing over and over again? I think what you need is what they call a paradigm shift. I think that phrase was first either made up or popularized by Thomas Kuhn, and he wrote a book called The Theory of Scientific Revolutions. So we need the central banks to recognize that they've made a profound ontological error, a paradigm shift. Paradigm shifts are really, really hard. And that's basically what Thomas Kuhn pointed out. And I think this is apocryphal, but one of the great physicists was purported to have said, "Science advances funeral by funeral." So you need, the old guys need to go before new ideas can come in. But it's very difficult, paradigm shift. And then Daniel Kahneman, more recently in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, has pointed out that when people are confronted with something that's just totally unexpected, given their analytical framework, they don't jettison the analytical framework or their previous beliefs. They jump into them even more because it's all they've got. So it turns out this is really just part of human nature. And lastly, of course, is if you've been doing the same thing over and over again, to say we got it wrong, we're going to do something different, is basically a statement that you got it wrong. And nobody is going to like to do that. So you've got a kind of block at all levels from changing view. Now, the second part of the question is, why do the guys that used to be central bankers suddenly see the light, including Mervyn King, suddenly see the light? I suspect that when they're there as central bankers, there's a lot of groupthink. You know, the people around the table, maybe even at the BIS, maybe particularly the BIS where I used to work, a lot of groupthink, led in large part by the Fed, although that may have changed in recent years. A lot of groupthink and a lot of group loyalty. You know, there's sometimes more loyalty between groups of people that are the same than, you know, between people of the same nationality. You know, they do form their own little society. Well, when you're outside of that, both the group think and the group loyalty tends to diminish, and might diminish pretty quickly. And so at that point, they're capable of looking back and saying, gee whiz, you know, that wasn't, you know, what we did was not really appropriate. So I held the pen for a big G30 study, which was called The Future of Central Banking. And I was asked to do it because they knew my views. And it was all central bankers, ex-central bankers, who asked me to do it. You know, so when they were there, so I don't really know. This is the realm of psychology. I mean, this is the realm of psychology, or maybe even of psychiatry. But
Well, Bill, that's
there's
great.
there's something.
I'm conscious.
That distinguishes.
I'm conscious that we're just slightly over our time today, so I want to thank you very much for informative, wide-ranging, and very thought-provoking commentary. To all the attendees, thank you very much for your participation today. As mentioned earlier, a prompt will appear to complete a post-webinar survey when you leave this session. Your feedback is valuable to us, so please do take a moment to fill out the survey. I also want to remind everyone of the next.
Hi, thank you. I think I'll jump in. I see it looks like Jason's having a little bit of connection issue, but just like to thank all the guests who joined. And Bill, thank you very much for doing this today.